The 7th of January, 1944. Westward Ho Beach, Devon, on the wild Atlantic coast of England. A small crowd of senior officers, scientists, and uniformed observers stand at a cautious distance behind a makeshift barrier of sandbags, breath visible in the cold morning air. Before them, on the wet sand, sits something that looks less like a weapon and more like a fairground ride gone catastrophically wrong. 2 enormous wooden wheels, each over 3 meters across, connected by a central drum packed with high explosive, with rows of rocket motors bolted around the rim like spokes on some monstrous Catherine wheel. Someone strikes a match. The rockets ignite in a roar of smoke and flame, and the contraption lurches forward, gathering speed across the sand towards an imaginary German bunker. For a few glorious seconds, it works exactly as intended. Then one of the rocket motors detaches. The whole device veers wildly off course, careering sideways with terrifying speed, sending the assembled dignitaries scrambling for cover behind dunes and sandbags as several tons of burning, spinning wood and metal hurtle directly towards them. A dog, reportedly, gives chase. The Panjandrum, Britain's great hope for breaching Hitler's Atlantic Wall, has just tried to kill the very people who built it. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. This actually happened more than once, and it explains why a weapon designed with deadly seriousness has gone down in history as one of the strangest things the British war machine ever attempted to build. To understand why anyone thought a giant explosive-filled wheel was a sensible answer to a military problem, you have to go back to the question that obsessed Allied planners in the years before D-Day. How do you blast a hole through a wall that Hitler had spent 2 years and untold tons of concrete making practically indestructible? By 1943, the problem facing Allied planners was stark. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched for roughly 5,000 kilometers along the coastline of occupied Europe, from Norway down to the Spanish border, and along the stretches earmarked for invasion, it bristled with reinforced concrete bunkers, some with walls over 2 meters thick. Conventional naval bombardment had proven frustratingly ineffective against this kind of fortification. Shells either failed to penetrate or simply chipped away at the surface without achieving a breach. Aerial bombing offered little improvement since hitting a small, heavily camouflaged bunker from altitude was as much luck as skill. Meanwhile, any invasion force storming the beaches would need those defenses neutralized in the opening minutes, not hours, of an assault, because every minute spent exposed on open sand under machine gun fire meant soldiers dying in numbers nobody wanted to contemplate. The existing solutions were not good enough. Combat engineers could, in principle, get close enough to plant explosive charges directly against bunker walls, but doing so meant walking or crawling across open beach under direct fire from the very gun ports they were trying to destroy. Specialist armored vehicles were being developed, eventually becoming the famous Hobart's Funnies, but these took time to land and maneuver, and a tracked vehicle moving at a few kilometers an hour across mined sand was an easy target. What planners wanted was something that could deliver several hundred kilograms of high explosive directly against a fortified wall, fast enough to avoid being destroyed en route without requiring a human being to walk it into place. In short, a self-propelled bomb that could survive the beach and detonate exactly where it needed to. It was an almost impossible set of requirements, and it was exactly the kind of problem that landed on the desk of the Admiralty's unofficial Department of Strange Ideas, a group formerly known as the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, but nicknamed with weary affection by those who worked there as the Wheezers and Dodgers. This was the same outfit responsible for an extraordinary range of unconventional projects throughout the war, run under the eccentric but genuinely brilliant leadership of a Royal Navy officer named Tommy Shanks, and staffed by a mixture of naval officers, engineers, and civilian boffins who specialized in exactly the kind of problem that conventional military thinking could not solve. The man most closely associated with the Panjandrum's eventual design was Neville Shute Norway, an engineer who would later become far better known to the public under his pen name, Neville Shute, as the author of novels including A Town Like Alice and On the Beach. Before his literary career, Norway had trained as an aeronautical engineer, and it was this background, combined with input from the directorate's other engineers, that produced the Panjandrum's strange but logically coherent design. The principle was, on paper, elegantly simple. Take two large wooden wheels, each roughly 3 meters in diameter, and connect them with a steel axle drum containing close to 2 tons of explosive. Around the rim of each wheel, mount rocket motors, originally cordite rockets of the kind used to launch barrage balloons, angled to drive the entire assembly forward across open beach. In theory, the wide wheels would distribute weight enough to cross soft sand and shingle without bogging down. The rockets would provide propulsion far faster than any tracked vehicle, and the whole device, weighing close to 2 tons fully loaded, would simply roll up to a bunker wall and detonate on contact, its 2-meter diameter and explosive payload more than sufficient to blast a hole through reinforced concrete. The engineering reality proved rather less elegant. Each wheel needed multiple rocket motors, sometimes as many as 18 across both wheels in later versions, and the fundamental challenge was keeping the thrust balanced. If the rockets on one side burned even slightly faster or hotter than those on the other, which cordite rockets of that era frequently did, the Panjandrum would not travel in the straight line that the entire concept depended upon. It would veer, and once a 2-ton flaming wheel weapon started veering at speed across a beach, there was no practical way to correct it. No steering mechanism, no brakes, nothing but raw momentum and whatever direction the uneven rockets happened to push it. Test after test followed the same pattern, promising acceleration followed by a drunken, terrifying loss of control. As the device span off course, shed rocket motors that continued to fly independently across the beach, or simply collapsed under its own structural strain. Construction took place at various sites along the Devon and Norfolk coasts, with the trials conducted largely on the wide, flat sands at Westward Ho, chosen precisely because the terrain resembled the kind of beach the weapon would eventually need to cross in occupied France. Production numbers remain difficult to pin down with precision, since the project never reached operational status, but historical accounts suggest perhaps a handful of prototype units were ever built and tested, each one slightly modified in an attempt to solve the persistent steering problem that had plagued every previous version. If you are finding this story as strange as it deserves to be, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The closest the Panjandrum came to any kind of operational deployment was, in truth, no deployment at all, but rather a series of demonstration trials before increasingly skeptical audiences of senior officers and Royal Marines. Accounts from witnesses present at the Westward Ho trials describe scenes of barely controlled chaos, rocket motors detaching mid-run and screaming off in unpredictable directions, the central drum sometimes breaking free of its mounting entirely and continuing to roll under its own momentum long after the rockets had burned out, and on at least one occasion, a wildly veering Panjandrum, sending a uniformed observer diving for cover behind a sand dune rather than risk standing his ground. Reports from the period describe Royal Marine commandos brought in to potentially operate the weapon watching these trials with open skepticism, and it is from this period that the weapon earned its enduring reputation among the men who might have had to use it as something closer to comedy than military hardware. No official record exists of the Panjandrum ever being used in combat, anywhere at any point in the war, because it never came close to reliable enough operation to justify the risk. What makes the Panjandrum worth remembering is not what it achieved, but what it reveals about the climate of desperate innovation that defined Britain's approach to the problem of breaching coastal defenses. The Germans, for their part, never attempted anything remotely comparable, relying instead on conventional demolition charges and, where available, captured or improvised armored vehicles to deal with fortifications, since the Wehrmacht's engineering culture favored proven, incremental solutions over speculative leaps. The Americans, facing the same beach assault problem ahead of their own landings, took a markedly different path, investing instead in the development of specialized armor, the demolition vehicle M1, O, and improvised tank-mounted projectors among them, alongside naval gunfire support refined through earlier Pacific landings. Compared with these approaches, the British solution stands out not for superior engineering, but for sheer audacity of concept. Nobody else in the war seriously proposed solving a beach assault problem with what was, in effect, an explosive Ferris wheel. It was neither copied nor adopted by any other nation, and with good reason. The Panjandrum's actual historical impact was, by any honest measure, negligible in material terms. It never fired a shot, never breached a bunker, and never came within sight of an actual German defensive position. Yet its legacy persists, not through battlefield accomplishment, but through the peculiar fascination it continues to generate among historians and the public alike, emblematic of a broader British wartime habit of pursuing unconventional, sometimes outlandish technical solutions when conventional approaches seemed inadequate to an impossible task. The same spirit that produced the Panjandrum also produced genuinely successful innovations, the Mulberry Harbors and the bouncing bomb among them, and it is worth remembering that desperate experimentation occasionally produces brilliance precisely because nobody involved was willing to accept that a problem was unsolvable. Surviving photographs and film footage of the Westward Ho trials remain held in the Imperial War Museum's archives, preserving for posterity the spectacle of Britain's most ambitious failed weapon careering across a Devon beach while horrified onlookers fled for their lives. Return for a moment to that beach in January 1944. The smoke clears. The dignitaries emerge cautiously from behind their sandbags, dusting themselves off, exchanging glances that suggest nobody present is entirely sure whether to laugh or to quietly note this project's death in their report. Somewhere on the sand, a rocket motor still smolders where it landed, having detached itself from a weapon that was meant to be Britain's answer to the Atlantic Wall. The Panjandrum never breached a single bunker. It never crossed a single beach under fire. It never killed a single German soldier, and very nearly killed several British ones instead. By every conventional measure of military success, it was an unambiguous failure, abandoned quietly before D-Day in favor of more reliable solutions. And yet it endures, nearly 80 years later, not despite its failure, but because of it. Because somewhere in the deadly, serious business of war, a group of engineers looked at an impossible problem and answered it with a giant flaming wheel, built it, tested it, watched it nearly kill them, and tried again anyway. That, perhaps, is the real story here. Not a weapon that worked, but a willingness to try something this strange in the first place. Britain built many weapons that helped win the Second World War. The Panjandrum is remembered not because it was among them, but because it so spectacularly, gloriously was not.